The house was never just walls and a roof to me. It was the only place in the world where my name felt real. Every crack in the floor had a memory. Every window had watched me grow older without judgment. I bought it after 30 years of struggle, years of saving, failing, starting again, and refusing to quit even when life made it easy to disappear. When I finally signed the papers, I stood alone in the empty living room and promised myself one thing: this place will never betray me. I was wrong, but not in the way people think. When I let them stay, it wasn't weakness, it was mercy. Family, they said. Trust, they said. Just for a while, they said. I had learned long ago that people don't always mean what they say, but I believed effort deserved respect. I believed kindness still counted for something. So I handed them the keys, not knowing I was also handing them silence, and silence can be dangerous in the wrong hands. At first, everything seemed normal. Small changes, new curtains, a different paint color in one room. They didn't ask, but I didn't complain. I told myself it didn't matter. It was still my house, still my rules, still my name on the deed. I had bigger things to focus on: work, responsibilities, life pressing forward without pause. But then the walls began to change. One afternoon, I came home and didn't recognize the place. The front door was gone, replaced with something heavier, louder. Inside, the living room wall had been knocked down. Dust coated the floor like a second skin. Tools lay everywhere, as if the house had been opened up without anesthesia. I stood there silently, no shouting, no questions, no anger on my face. They looked at me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for permission they never asked for. When I said nothing, they smiled. That was the moment they misunderstood me completely. They thought silence meant approval. They thought silence meant fear. They thought silence meant they had won. Don't worry, one of them said casually. We're improving it. Improving it. As if improvement was something you could decide for someone else. As if ownership was optional. As if respect was outdated. I nodded once and walked away. That nod became their evidence. In their minds, it was a green light. Renovations accelerated. Contractors came and went. Money was spent like it wasn't earned. Walls were moved, rooms redefined, decisions made without my name attached to any of them. My house was becoming unfamiliar, and worse, it was becoming theirs. People around me noticed, but they misunderstood too. Why are you letting this happen? Why don't you stop them? Are you scared to speak up? I didn't answer those questions either, because what they didn't know was that silence wasn't surrender. Silence was observation. I was watching everything, the dates, the changes, the arrogance growing with every hammer strike. I was listening to how they spoke about my house when they thought I wasn't around. I was noting every line they crossed, every assumption they made. They believed power came from noise. I knew power comes from patience. Late at night, when the house was quiet again, I walked through the rooms alone. I touched the altered walls, the new floors, the unfamiliar corners. There was anger in my chest, yes, but there was also clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you realize exactly who someone is. This wasn't about renovation anymore. This was about entitlement. This was about boundaries. This was about a lesson that needed to be taught properly. I remembered every sacrifice that built this place. The overtime shifts, the nights I skipped meals, the years I lived smaller so I could own something bigger. No one had lifted a finger then. No one had offered help when the weight was heavy. Yet now, they felt free to rewrite my home without my consent. That was when I made a quiet decision. I would not argue. I would not threaten. I would not beg for respect in a house that already knew my worth. I would let them continue. Because the strongest moves are often invisible until it's too late to stop them. As they laughed and planned and celebrated their new space, I returned to my routines, calm and unreadable. I let them believe they were in control. I let them think the silence meant weakness. But inside, something had hardened, not into hatred, but into resolve. This house had tested me before. Life had tested me harder. And when the time came, The truth would speak louder than any argument ever could. They just didn't know it yet. Silence has a sound when you live inside it long enough. It hums in your chest, steady and patient, waiting for the right moment to speak. That was the season I entered after the renovations began, a season where every word felt unnecessary, and every reaction felt like a gift I refused to give. By the second month, my house no longer felt like a place I returned to. It felt like a place I visited. Each time I opened the door, something else had changed. A wall pushed back, a window widened, a room renamed. They talked about the house as if it were a shared project, a group effort, something they were building together. My name slowly disappeared from their sentences. This will be our room. We decided to open this space. With thought, this design made more sense. I listened. When they noticed my silence, they mistook it for confusion. When they noticed my calm, they mistook it for acceptance. People often think loud anger is strength and quiet endurance is weakness. They never consider that silence might be strategy. They spoke freely around me. That was their biggest mistake. One evening, I sat at the dining table, one of the few pieces of furniture still untouched, while they discussed future plans, bigger changes, more money, long-term ideas that assumed permanence. This place is basically ours now, someone said with a laugh. He hasn't said a word. The words landed heavier than any insult, not because they hurt, but because they revealed everything. In that moment, I understood something clearly. They were no longer guests who crossed a line. They were people who believed the line no longer existed. My silence had become their permission slip. So I stayed silent. I stopped correcting them. I stopped reminding them whose house it was. I stopped defending what should never have been questioned. Instead, I started collecting truth. I kept records quietly, dates, photos, messages. I remembered who approved what, who paid nothing, who decided everything. I listened to contractors talk about invoices that weren't in my name. I watched decisions being made without me, but about me. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, not with anger, but with precision. I knew this wasn't a fight that could be won with shouting. Shouting would only turn me into the villain of their story. Silence allowed them to expose themselves, and they did. They began acting bolder. Rules were ignored. My schedule was treated as an inconvenience. If I objected, even gently, they reminded me how much they had improved the house. You should be grateful, one of them said once. One made it better, grateful. For losing control of my own home, I looked at them and said nothing. That was the moment their respect fully disappeared. And oddly, that was the moment my power fully returned. Because when someone believes you have none, they stop protecting themselves, they stopped hiding conversations. They stopped pretending to ask. They stopped seeing me as an obstacle. They saw me as background. That allowed me to move quietly through the storm. I consulted without announcing. I researched without sharing. I learned exactly where I stood, not emotionally, but legally. I didn't rush. I didn't reveal my hand. Every night, as the house echoed with unfamiliar sounds, I reminded myself this is temporary. Control doesn't disappear, it waits. There were moments, of course, when silence felt heavy, when I wanted to speak, to shout, to reclaim space with words. But I had learned something over 30 years of life. Words can be twisted, actions cannot. So I let them believe the story they were telling themselves, that I was passive, that I was unsure, that I didn't know what to do. They smiled more. They relaxed, they grew careless. And in their carelessness, they built the case against themselves brick by brick. One night, standing alone in what used to be my living room, I realized something important. The house hadn't been taken from me. It had revealed the truth about everyone inside it. Silence hadn't weakened me. It had sharpened me. And soon, very soon, it would no longer be quiet. By the third month, the house no longer whispered change, it shouted it. Every step I took landed on something unfamiliar. The floor felt different under my feet, like it no longer recognized me. The walls stood taller, colder, reshaped by hands that never asked permission. What once felt like home now felt like evidence. I had stopped counting the changes because counting meant caring too loudly. But I felt every one of them. Each brick laid without my consent felt like a sentence written against my name. They weren't just renovating a house anymore, they were rewriting my place in it. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, in the way they stopped telling me when workers were coming, in the way my belongings were moved without explanation, in the way rooms I had lived in for years were suddenly treated as common space. My private corners became public decisions. One morning I found my things stacked in boxes. Not carefully, not respectfully, just moved because they were in the way. In the way of what? I asked myself. Progress, they would say. Improvement. A better future. But whose future? They had begun inviting people over. Friends, relatives, strangers who walked through my house like tourists in a finished project. I overheard them explaining design choices, pointing at walls, laughing proudly. We did all this ourselves, they said. Not we live here, not we are grateful, but we did this. I stood in the background, invisible in my own home, watching credit being claimed for something that was never theirs to begin with. That was when the betrayal stopped being personal and became structural. It wasn't just about trust anymore, it was about erasure. I remembered the first night I slept in this house years ago. There was no furniture, no curtains, no comfort, just space and possibility. I had sat on the floor and felt proud. That pride returned now, but twisted into something heavier. Pride mixed with anger is dangerous when misunderstood. They noticed my distance and interpreted it as defeat. You don't even seem to care anymore, one of them said, almost kindly. I looked at the wall behind them, fresh paint, wrong color, and said nothing. That silence gave them confidence. They made bigger decisions, structural decisions, things that could not be undone easily. They talked about long-term living arrangements as if time itself belonged to them now. I began to realize they weren't just crossing lines, they were building on the assumption that I would never stop them. Every brick placed without permission was a bet against my resolve. At night, when the noise finally stopped, I walked through the house slowly. I traced the edges of new walls, felt the roughness where something had been removed too quickly. I noticed how rushed work always leaves scars. Renovation done without respect always does. In those quiet hours, I confronted the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't just hurt. I was being tested. They wanted to see how much they could take before I reacted, how far silence could be pushed before it broke. And I understood then that reacting emotionally would only reward them. So I let the betrayal deepen. I let them stack bricks on top of assumptions. I let them invest themselves fully in the illusion of control. Because the more they believed this was theirs, the harder the fall would be when reality returned. I started detaching emotionally. That was the hardest part. Loving a place means it can wound you. Detachment turned pain into clarity. I stopped seeing the house as damaged. I started seeing it as a stage where everyone was revealing who they truly were. They grew louder, more confident, more careless with their words. No one can stop this now, I heard one of them say once. It's too late. I almost smiled. Because betrayal always thinks it has won right before the truth arrives. What they didn't know was that every unauthorized change strengthened my position. Every ignored boundary documented their entitlement. Every brick they laid without consent became weight on their side of the scale. The house may have looked different, but ownership doesn't change with paint and noise. It changes with law, with patience, with timing. And timing was something I had learned to respect. By the end of that month, I no longer felt anger when I walked through the house. I felt certainty. The kind that settles deep and doesn't shake. The kind that knows this chapter is not the end, but the setup. They thought they were building a future. In truth, they were building my case. Celebration has a rhythm. It's loud, careless, and blind. While they celebrated, I moved quietly through the background of my own life, unseen and underestimated. They believed the hard part was over. They believed control had already changed hands. That belief gave me the space I needed. The house was finished, or at least finished enough for them to show off. New walls stood firm. Fresh paint covered old memories. The smell of cement still lingered, mixed with pride that didn't belong to them. They walked through the rooms like owners, pointing, explaining, laughing. I watched from a distance, saying little, remembering everything. They toasted to new beginnings. I documented endings. They talked about comfort and plans. I studied timelines. They assumed permanence. I prepared precision. This was the phase where mistakes happen when people relax, when they believe the risk has passed, when arrogance replaces caution. And arrogance always leaves fingerprints. I started with quiet confirmation. I reviewed what I already knew, then verified what I didn't. Ownership, authority, consent. Everything I needed was clear. The foundation of the house hadn't changed, no matter how many walls they moved. The truth was still solid beneath the noise. I didn't confront anyone. Confrontation warns. I didn't threaten. Threats educate. I chose invisibility instead. My daily routine remained unchanged. I went to work. I came home. I nodded when spoken to. I listened more than I replied. They mistook routine for resignation. That assumption was my greatest advantage. Late at night, when the house finally slept, I became active. I organized, I sorted, I prepared, not emotionally, but methodically. I revisited every step that had brought me here, learning from each moment where kindness had been mistaken for permission. I reminded myself this isn't revenge. This is correction. They were comfortable now, too comfortable. They rearranged schedules without asking. They borrowed spaces without notice. They spoke about future upgrades like investors planning expansion. They had fully stepped into a role that was never theirs, and no one plays a role more recklessly than someone who believes the stage belongs to them. There were moments when doubt tried to speak. Quiet thoughts late at night asking if this was worth it, if peace would be easier than principle. But peace without respect is just silence dressed up as comfort. I had lived that silence long enough. One evening, I overheard them discussing legal matters casually, laughing at the idea of anyone challenging them. "He won't do anything," one of them said. "Never does." I memorized that sentence. Because underestimation is a gift, they had stopped hiding. That told me everything I needed to know. The celebration had made them careless. Carelessness always exposes weakness. I began setting the stage, not publicly, not dramatically, but in ways that couldn't be undone. I ensured my position was clean, undeniable, and patient. I didn't rush the process. Rushing is emotional. I was beyond that now. The house, once a source of pain, became a source of calm. I walked through it without attachment, knowing the outcome was already decided. When you know how something ends, the middle loses its power. They continued celebrating, hosting, expanding, making plans that assumed I would always remain silent. They built their future on my past behavior, not realizing behavior changes when awareness arrives, and awareness had arrived fully. I stopped seeing them as enemies. I saw them as people who had made a miscalculation. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought patience meant fear. They confused kindness with permission. They were wrong. By the end of that chapter, nothing outward had changed. The house looked the same. Their confidence remained high. Their laughter still filled the rooms. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. The preparation was complete. And once preparation ends, action doesn't announce itself. It arrives. The day arrived without drama, no thunder, no raised voices, no warning, just a quiet morning that looked like every other one until it wasn't. Truth rarely announces itself. It waits until it can no longer be ignored. They were still comfortable. That was clear. Coffee on the counter, laughter in the air, plans being made as if the future was already signed over. I watched them move through the house with ownership in their steps, confidence in their tone. They had settled fully into the lie they built. I said nothing. That was the last time silence belonged to them. When the moment came, it didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, the kind that doesn't shake, doesn't raise its voice, doesn't need to explain itself twice. I placed the truth where it could be seen, not argued with. Documents don't shout. Facts don't insult. Authority doesn't beg. The room went quiet as eyes moved across paper and screens. Confusion came first, then disbelief. Then the slow realization that confidence built on assumption collapses instantly when reality arrives. This can't be right. Someone said, it was. They looked at me then, not as background, not as silence, but as presence. For the first time in months, they saw me clearly, not emotional, not angry, just resolved. I hadn't come to argue. Arguments invite excuses. I had come to end confusion. They tried to speak over one another. Explanations poured out. Justifications, good intentions, improvements, family, effort. All the words that had replaced respect, I let them finish. Because once people expose their reasoning, there's no need to challenge it. It collapses under its own weight. I never gave permission, I said calmly. One sentence. No emotion attached. That sentence did what months of silence could not. It reset the room. They pointed to walls, to money spent, to time invested. They spoke faster now, louder, desperate to hold on to something that was already gone. But effort without consent is not ownership. Investment without authority is not control. And silence is not surrender. The truth stood between us, undeniable and unmoved. For the first time, they realized the house had never stopped being mine. Not legally, not morally, not in any way that mattered. Fear entered their voices. It sounded different from anger, thin, uncertain, searching for compromise where none existed. They asked questions they should have asked months ago. What do you want to do now? How can we fix this? Why didn't you say something sooner? I looked around the room, the altered walls, the stolen confidence, the months of disregard, and answered honestly, you already decided without me, I said. Now the decision is mine. That was the moment the power shifted completely. No shouting followed, no threats, just consequences moving into place, calmly, correctly. Without drama, they understood then that preparation beats reaction every time. They had believed noise was strength. They had believed silence was weakness. That belief had cost them everything. The house felt different that day, not because of walls or paint, but because truth had reclaimed it. Space returned. Air felt lighter. Ownership settled back into place where it belonged. They left the room quieter than they entered it. Smaller, not humiliated, just corrected. I stood alone afterward, looking at what had been changed, and felt something unexpected: peace. Not victory, not revenge. Peace. Because I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply taken myself back. The house was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that feels empty. This silence felt earned. The laughter that once echoed through rooms without respect was gone, replaced by stillness that finally belonged to me. For the first time in months, the house breathed the same way I did. They moved differently now, carefully, cautiously. Every step carried awareness. Every word was measured. The confidence they once wore so easily had cracked, and in its place was something unfamiliar: recognition. They finally understood. Not all strength is loud. Not all power demands attention. And not all silence is surrender. I walked through the house slowly, not inspecting damage, not counting losses, just reclaiming space. The walls no longer felt like accusations. The rooms no longer felt borrowed. Even the changes they made no longer angered me. They were reminders, proof, lessons written in brick and cement. They tried to repair what couldn't be undone, with apologies, with explanations, with sudden respect. I listened, because listening costs nothing, but respect that arrives late is still respect that had to be forced. I didn't humiliate them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. Silence, when chosen, is control. Patience, when intentional, is power. They had mistaken restraint for fear. kindness for permission, and calm for weakness. That misunderstanding had reshaped their fate more than any renovation ever could. The house settled back into rhythm. Mornings felt lighter, nights felt honest, even the altered walls seemed to stand straighter now, as if they too recognized who they belonged to. Ownership isn't just legal, it's emotional, and that emotional ownership had returned fully. I thought back to the moment I handed them the keys. I had trusted. That trust had been broken, but it hadn't broken me, it had clarified me. Some lessons cost money, some cost relationships, some cost comfort. This one cost illusion. They no longer spoke over me. They no longer decided for me. When they looked at me now, they didn't see silence, they saw certainty. And certainty makes people careful. I didn't need revenge. Revenge requires anger. I had moved past that. What I needed was balance, and balance had been restored. The house stood as it always had, mine. Changed, yes, but stronger like me. The experience had stripped away softness I could no longer afford and replaced it with something sharper, steadier. Silence had been my shield. Truth had been my weapon. Timing had been my victory. As I closed the door that night, I felt something settle deep inside my chest. Not bitterness, not regret, just understanding. People will test boundaries when they think there are none. They will take when they think you won't stop them. They will mistake your calm for permission. Let them. Because when the moment comes, and it always does, silence speaks louder than anything they've ever heard.